Tommy had always been my golden boy. From the time he was small, running around our little house in Cedar Falls, Iowa, he was the kind of kid who made other mothers jealous. He'd help me carry groceries without being asked, always remembered to call if he was going to be late, and still gave me hugs before bed even when he turned 16 and his friends thought it was uncool. We'd been through everything together, just the two of us. His father left when Tommy was only 8, disappeared one Tuesday morning like smoke, leaving nothing but unpaid bills and broken promises. I worked double shifts at the diner on Main Street to keep us afloat, and Tommy never complained. Not once. He'd do his homework at the counter while I served coffee to truck drivers and locals, and he'd walk himself home when I couldn't leave early. Those were hard years, but they were good years too. We had our routines, our inside jokes, our Friday night movies with popcorn on the couch. Tommy would tell me about school, about his friends Jake and Marcus, about the girl in his chemistry class he thought was pretty. I knew everything about his world, and he seemed happy to let me in. But something started changing last spring. It was subtle at first, like a shadow creeping across a sunny room. The hugs became shorter, then stopped altogether. When I'd ask about his day, he'd grunt and disappear upstairs. The boy who used to help me with dinner suddenly had somewhere else to be every night. I told myself it was normal. He was 18 now, a senior at Cedar Falls High. Boys his age were supposed to pull away from their mothers, weren't they? I'd seen it happen to my friends with their kids. But this felt different. Meaner. The first time he snapped at me, I was so shocked I couldn't even respond. I'd simply asked him to take out the trash, something he'd done 1,000 times before. But instead of his usual, "Sure, Mom," he whipped around with fire in his eyes. "Can't you see I'm busy?" he snarled, gesturing at his phone like it contained the secrets of the universe. I stood there in the kitchen, holding a dish towel, feeling like I'd been slapped. This wasn't my Tommy. My Tommy said please and thank you. My Tommy noticed when I was tired and would make me tea without being asked. The incidents piled up like storm clouds. He started eating his meals in his room, leaving dirty plates for me to collect like some kind of maid. When I knocked on his door to ask if he wanted to watch our usual Thursday night show, he told me he had better things to do. The way he said it, with such casual cruelty, made my chest ache. I tried to give him space, thinking maybe he was stressed about graduation or college applications. But the space only seemed to make him more distant, more hostile. He'd come home from school and walk right past me like I was furniture. If I dared to ask where he'd been or who he'd been with, he'd roll his eyes so hard I thought they might stick that way. "You're so paranoid," he'd mutter, stomping up the stairs. "I can't even breathe in this house." I started second-guessing everything. Maybe I was too clingy. Maybe I asked too many questions. I'd raised him alone for 10 years. Had I somehow smothered him? I lay awake at night, replaying conversations, searching for the moment I'd lost him. The worst part was the way he looked at me, where there used to be warmth, maybe even admiration. Now there was something cold and calculating, like he was sizing me up and finding me lacking. It reminded me of the way his father used to look at me near the end, like I was an inconvenience he couldn't wait to escape. I tried talking to my sister Linda about it when she called from Des Moines. "Boys that age are just difficult," she said, but I could hear the worry in her voice. "He'll come around." But weeks turned into months, and he didn't come around. If anything, he got worse. He started staying out later, sometimes not coming home until after midnight. When I'd wait up, worried sick, he'd act like I was the crazy one. "What's wrong with you?" he'd ask, seeing me sitting at the kitchen table in my bathrobe. "I'm 18. I don't need a babysitter." The Tommy I knew would have apologized for making me worry. This new version just shook his head and walked away, leaving me sitting there feeling foolish and hurt. I started making excuses for him to other people, when Mrs. Henderson from next door asked why Tommy didn't help me with yard work anymore. I smiled and said he was busy with school. When my manager at the diner mentioned that Tommy seemed different when he picked me up after work, I laughed it off and said teenagers were moody. But inside, I was falling apart. This boy had been my whole world for so long, and now it felt like he couldn't stand to be in the same room as me. I'd catch glimpses of the old Tommy sometimes, like when he was talking to his friends or laughing at something on his phone. The smile was the same. The laugh was the same. But none of it was for me anymore. I kept hoping it was a phase, that whatever was eating at him would pass like a bad cold. I told myself that deep down, he still loved me. He had to. We'd been through too much together for it to just disappear. But love felt very far away on the nights when he'd come home angry, slamming doors and making the whole house feel unsafe. Love felt impossible when he'd look right through me like I was invisible. Or worse, like I was something disgusting he'd stepped in. I was losing my son, and I didn't understand why. More terrifying still, I was starting to lose myself too. The confident woman who'd raised a child alone, who'd worked her way up to assistant manager at the diner, who'd built a life from nothing, was crumbling under the weight of his rejection. Something had changed in my boy. Something fundamental and frightening. I just didn't know what. And I didn't know if I'd ever get him back. 3 weeks later, I was folding laundry in the living room when I heard the familiar buzz of Tommy's phone. He'd left it on the coffee table when he went upstairs to shower, something he never did anymore. Usually, that phone was glued to his hand like it was keeping him alive. I glanced at the screen as it lit up with a text message. The name that appeared made me pause. Cassie. I'd never heard him mention anyone named Cassie. For a boy who used to tell me everything, he'd become surprisingly secretive about his social life. The phone buzzed again. Then again. My curiosity got the better of me, and before I could stop myself, I picked it up. I'd never snooped through Tommy's things before. I'd always trusted him, always respected his privacy. But these weren't normal times. I swiped to unlock the screen, grateful he hadn't changed his passcode from his birthday. The messages from Cassie filled the screen, and with each one I read, my stomach dropped further. Your mom is seriously controlling. One message read, "It's not normal for an 18-year-old to have to check in all the time." Tommy's response made my hands tremble. I know. She acts like she owns me. I scrolled up, finding weeks of conversations I'd never known existed. Cassie's messages painted me as a manipulative, clingy mother who couldn't let go. She called me pathetic and desperate, said I was emotionally abusing Tommy by expecting him to spend time with me. But Tommy's replies were worse than anything she said. He agreed with every cruel assessment, added his own bitter commentary. He called me suffocating and crazy. He said I made him sick, that he couldn't wait to get away from me. Reading his words was like being stabbed over and over, each message a fresh wound. She doesn't even work real hours, he'd written just 2 days ago. She's at that stupid diner pretending to be important when she's just a waitress who never did anything with her life. I had to set the phone down and breathe. This was my son, the boy I'd sacrificed everything for. I'd worked double shifts to pay for his school clothes, his sports fees, his class trips. I'd given up dates, friendships, dreams of my own to make sure he had everything he needed. And this was how he saw me? There were photos too. Pictures of a girl with long blonde hair and too much makeup, probably around Tommy's age but trying to look older. She was pretty in an artificial way, all sharp angles and posed smiles. In some of the photos, she was with Tommy, her arms wrapped around him possessively. He looked happy in ways I hadn't seen in months. I kept scrolling, discovering a relationship that had apparently been going on for over 3 months. 3 months of secret meetings, of lies about where he was going and who he was with. 3 months of this girl filling his head with poison about me. The worst part was how she manipulated him. I could see it clearly now, the way she'd plant seeds of doubt and then water them with sympathy. "You deserve better than this," she'd write after encouraging him to complain about me. "A real mother wouldn't make you feel guilty for having a life." She was older than Tommy, I realized. 23, according to her profile picture comments. She had her own apartment, her own car, her own life, and she was using all of that independence to make my 18-year-old son feel trapped and immature in his own home. The messages revealed their plan too. She wanted him to move in with her after graduation. "You don't owe her anything," she'd written. "She chose to have you. That was her decision, not yours. You don't have to spend your whole life paying her back." Reading those words, I understood everything. The sudden coldness, the anger, the way he looked at me like I was his enemy instead of his mother. She'd taken every normal thing about our relationship, every natural expectation between parent and child, and twisted it into something ugly. When Tommy came back downstairs, hair still damp from his shower. I was sitting exactly where I'd been before, folding the same towel I'd been holding when this all started. He picked up his phone without looking at me, checking his messages with the same smile I'd seen in those photos. "I'm going out," he announced, grabbing his keys from the bowl by the door. "Where?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. He paused, and for a moment, I thought he might actually tell me the truth. Instead, he shrugged. "Just out. Don't wait up." I watched him leave, my heart breaking a little more with each step. I wanted to confront him, to show him what I'd seen, to make him understand how he was being manipulated. But I also knew that anything I said would only be twisted, filtered through Cassie's lens, and used as more evidence of my controlling behavior. That night, I called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee that went cold while I tried to figure out what to do. I'd lost my son to a stranger, and I didn't know how to get him back. The worst part was the doubt she'd planted in my own mind. Was I too controlling? Had I held on too tight? I'd raised him alone, yes, but I'd tried to do it right. I'd encouraged his independence, supported his interests, trusted him with freedom. But now, looking at everything through her poisonous perspective, I second-guessed every decision I'd ever made. I kept the phone conversation to myself. I couldn't bear to tell Linda or anyone else what I'd discovered. It would mean admitting that my relationship with my son was built on lies, that the boy I'd raised to be honest and kind was capable of such cruelty. I still hoped, desperately, that he'd come to his senses, that he'd see through her manipulation and come back to me. I held on to that hope like a lifeline, even as everything around me was falling apart. The knock came early on a Saturday morning in late May. I was still in my pajamas, drinking coffee and reading yesterday's newspaper, when I heard the sharp rap on my front door. Through the window, I could see Tommy standing on the porch, but he wasn't alone. The girl next to him had to be Cassie. She was smaller than I'd expected from her photos, but everything else matched. The blonde hair, the carefully applied makeup, the way she stood like she owned whatever space she occupied. She was wearing a sundress that probably cost more than I made in a week, and her smile was the kind that never reached her eyes. I opened the door slowly, suddenly aware of my messy hair and old robe. "Tommy? Mom, this is Cassie," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. "Can we come in? We need to talk to you about something." My heart started racing, but I stepped aside to let them in. Cassie walked into my living room like she was inspecting it, her gaze taking in our secondhand furniture and family photos with barely concealed disdain. She settled onto my couch without being invited, crossing her legs and making herself comfortable. Tommy remained standing, shifting his weight from foot to foot. I'd seen him nervous before, but this was different. This was guilt. "Mrs. Patterson," Cassie began, and I immediately disliked how she said my name, like it tasted bad in her mouth. "Tommy and I have been talking, and we think it's time for some changes around here." Changes? I looked between them, feeling like I was missing something important. Cassie's smile widened, but it was cold as winter. Tommy's an adult now. He shouldn't have to live under such restrictive conditions anymore. I wanted to laugh. Restrictive conditions? This was my home, and Tommy was my son. I'd given him more freedom than most kids his age, more trust than he'd apparently deserved. But I bit my tongue and waited for her to continue. "He's moving in with me after graduation," she announced, like it was already decided. "We think it's best if he cuts ties with negative influences." The way she said negative influences while looking directly at me made my blood run cold. This girl, who'd been in my son's life for a few months, was sitting in my living room telling me I was bad for him. "Tommy?" I looked at my son, hoping to see some sign of the boy I'd raised. "Is this what you want?" He finally looked at me, and the stranger behind his eyes made me want to cry. "Mom, you have to understand. I can't keep living like this. Cassie's helped me see that our relationship isn't healthy. Isn't healthy." The words came out sharper than I intended. What exactly is unhealthy about a mother who loves her son? Cassie leaned forward, her voice taking on a practiced sympathy that made my skin crawl. "Mrs. Patterson, I know this is hard for you, but Tommy needs space to grow into his own person. You've been holding him back, whether you realize it or not." I stood up, my hands shaking with anger. Holding him back? I've worked 2 jobs to put him through school. I've supported every dream he's ever had. You've made him feel guilty for having a life outside this house," Cassie interrupted. "You've made him think he owes you something just for doing what mothers are supposed to do." Tommy nodded along with her words, and that hurt more than anything she could have said to me directly. This was my son agreeing that loving him, sacrificing for him, being there for him was somehow wrong. "Tommy, honey," I tried, my voice breaking. "We can work this out. We don't need her to." "See?" Cassie turned to Tommy with vindication in her voice. "She can't even handle us having this conversation without trying to manipulate you." I saw the moment Tommy's face hardened completely. Whatever small part of him might have been wavering disappeared. "Mom, I'm 18. I can make my own decisions." "Of course you can," I said desperately. "But this isn't you making decisions. This is her making them for you." Cassie stood up then, her whole demeanor shifting. The fake sweetness dropped away, replaced by something much more dangerous. "I think we're done talking." She nodded to Tommy, who moved toward me with something in his hands. It took me a moment to realize it was rope, thick and coarse like the kind we used to tie down tarps in the garage. "Tommy, what are you doing?" I backed away, but there wasn't far to go in my small living room. "Just stay calm, Mom," he said, but his voice was shaking. "We're not going to hurt you. We just need you to come with us." The world seemed to tilt sideways. This couldn't be happening. My son, my baby, was standing in my living room with rope in his hands, taking orders from a girl who'd poisoned his mind against me. "Tommy, please," I whispered. "You don't want to do this. I know you don't." For just a second, I saw a flicker of the boy I remembered. His hands hesitated, and he glanced at me with something that might have been uncertainty. But then Cassie moved closer to him, put her hand on his arm, and the moment was gone. "She's trying to manipulate you again," Cassie whispered, loud enough for me to hear. "This is exactly what we talked about." Tommy's jaw set with determination that looked foreign on his face. "I'm sorry, Mom, but this is the only way." They bound my wrists while I pleaded with them, while I promised to give Tommy all the space he wanted, while I begged them to just leave instead of whatever this was. But neither of them would listen. Cassie supervised while Tommy did the work, her satisfaction obvious as she watched my own son tie me up like a criminal. They led me outside to a pickup truck I'd never seen before. The morning air was crisp and clean, such a normal spring day that it felt surreal to be living through something so unthinkable. Mrs. Henderson was working in her garden next door, but the hedge blocked her view of us. Tommy helped me into the truck bed with more gentleness than I'd expected, and for a moment I thought maybe he was starting to realize how wrong this was. But then Cassie climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine, and I knew there was no going back. As we pulled away from my house, from the street where I'd raised Tommy, where we'd been happy for so many years, I couldn't stop staring at the back of his head through the truck's rear window. Even now, even after everything, part of me still believed my son was in there somewhere, that the real Tommy would come back and make this nightmare stop. But with each mile we drove away from home, that hope got smaller and smaller. The truck bounced and jolted over back roads I didn't recognize, carrying us further away from Cedar Falls with each passing minute. I tried to keep track of our direction, but after an hour of winding country roads, I was completely lost. My wrists ached from the rope, and every bump sent pain shooting through my bound arms. Through the rear window, I could see Tommy's profile as he stared out the passenger side. Cassie was driving, her hands steady on the wheel like this was just another Saturday drive. They weren't talking, at least not that I could see, but there was something planned about this whole thing that scared me more than if it had been impulsive. The pavement gave way to gravel, then to dirt. We were climbing now, heading into the wooded hills west of town. I'd been out this way before, years ago, when Tommy was little, and we'd go on nature walks. But that felt like a different lifetime, when my son still held my hand and pointed out interesting rocks and birds. The truck finally stopped in what seemed like the middle of nowhere. Dense forest stretched in every direction, the canopy so thick overhead that it felt like twilight even though it was barely noon. The silence when Cassie turned off the engine was complete, the kind of quiet that only exists far from civilization. Tommy climbed out first, then came around to help me down from the truck bed. His touch was gentle, but his face was closed off. like he'd shut down every emotion that might interfere with whatever they had planned. "Where are we?" I asked, though I didn't expect an answer. Cassie had gotten out and was stretching, acting like we were on some kind of picnic. "Somewhere private," she said with that cold smile. "Somewhere we can talk without interruptions." They started walking me deeper into the woods, Tommy on one side and Cassie on the other. The forest floor was soft with years of fallen leaves, and I stumbled several times over hidden roots and rocks. The rope around my wrists made it impossible to catch myself properly, and both times I fell. Tommy helped me up without meeting my eyes. We walked for what felt like forever, the trees getting thicker and the path fainter with each step. I could hear water somewhere in the distance, probably a creek, and the sounds of birds and small animals moving through the underbrush. It would have been peaceful under different circumstances. Finally, we reached a small clearing where someone had obviously camped before. There was a ring of stones for a fire pit and a few logs arranged like benches. Cassie gestured for me to sit on one of the logs, and I did, grateful to rest even under these circumstances. "Now what?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Cassie walked over to Tommy and whispered something in his ear. He nodded, then started gathering sticks and dry leaves like he was going to build a fire. The normal, everyday nature of the task made everything feel even more surreal. "You know," Cassie said conversationally, settling onto the log across from me, "Tommy's told me so much about you, about how you never let him make his own choices, how you made him feel guilty every time he wanted to spend time with friends or have a normal teenage life. That's not true," I said quietly. "Isn't it?" She tilted her head like she was genuinely curious. "When was the last time Tommy made a decision without running it by you first? When was the last time he stayed out late without you waiting up, making him feel bad about it?" I wanted to argue, but something in her tone made me stop. She wasn't angry or hostile anymore. She was calm, matter of fact, like a teacher explaining a simple concept to a slow student. "I was protecting him," I said finally. "From what? From growing up? From becoming independent?" Cassie shook her head. "You were protecting yourself, Mrs. Patterson. From being alone." Tommy had gotten a small fire started, and the smoke drifted between us. He was still avoiding my eyes, focused entirely on feeding twigs to the flames. "You raised him to need you," Cassie continued, "to feel responsible for your happiness. That's not love. That's manipulation." "I love my son," I said, and my voice broke on the words. "I'm sure you think you do. But real love means letting go. It means wanting what's best for the other person, even if it hurts you." She stood up and walked closer to me. "Tommy will never be free as long as you're in his life, making him feel guilty for living." The sound came out of nowhere, a sharp crack that echoed through the trees. At first, I thought it was a branch breaking, but then I heard the voice. What the hell is going on here? A man emerged from between the trees, wearing camouflage hunting gear and carrying a rifle. He was older, maybe in his 50s, with a graying beard and the kind of weathered face that spoke of years spent outdoors. His eyes went from Cassie to Tommy to me, taking in the rope around my wrists, the fear in my face. "Everything's fine," Cassie said quickly, but her calm composure had cracked. "Just a family discussion." The hunter's eyes narrowed. "Doesn't look like a discussion to me." He raised his rifle slightly, not quite pointing it at anyone, but making his intentions clear. "Ma'am, are you here against your will?" I opened my mouth to answer, but before I could speak, Tommy moved. Later, I would wonder what had gone through his mind in that moment. Fear, probably. Panic at being caught. Or maybe, after months of Cassie's influence, he genuinely saw this stranger as a threat to their plan. He lunged at the hunter with a desperation that caught everyone off guard. The two men crashed together, Tommy's youth and athletic build matched against the older man's experience and strength. They rolled across the forest floor, fighting for control of the rifle. I screamed Tommy's name, struggling against the ropes that held me. Cassie was shouting too, but I couldn't make out her words over the sound of my own voice and the grunts and crashes of the two men fighting. The rifle went off with a sound like thunder in the quiet forest. Both men went still for a heartbeat that lasted forever, and then Tommy rolled away, clutching his side. Dark red was spreading across his shirt, and when he looked at me, his eyes were wide with shock and pain. The hunter scrambled to his feet, still holding his rifle. breathing hard. Jesus, he muttered, looking down at Tommy. I didn't mean... He came at me. I didn't have a choice. Cassie was on her knees beside Tommy, her hands fluttering uselessly over his wound. All her cold confidence was gone, replaced by raw panic. Do something, she screamed at the hunter. Help him. But I was already moving, fighting against the ropes with a strength I didn't know I had. The sight of my son bleeding, hurt, maybe dying, burned away everything else. Nothing else mattered. Not the betrayal, not the pain he'd caused me. Nothing but getting to him. The forest had gone completely silent except for Tommy's labored breathing and Cassie's quiet sobbing. Even the birds had stopped singing, as if the whole world was holding its breath to see what would happen next. Time seemed to slow down as I stared at Tommy lying on the forest floor. The red stain on his shirt was spreading, dark against the blue fabric, and his face had gone pale in a way that made my heart stop. All the anger I'd been carrying, all the hurt and confusion of the past months, disappeared in an instant. He was my son, and he was bleeding, and nothing else in the world mattered. I twisted my wrists against the rope, ignoring the pain as it cut into my skin. The knots were tight, but desperation gave me strength I'd never known I had. The rough fibers scraped away skin, leaving my wrists raw and burning, but I kept working at them. Tommy, I called out, my voice cracking. Baby, look at me. His eyes found mine, and for the first time in months, I saw my real son there. Not the angry stranger Cassie had created, but the boy who used to come to me when he had nightmares, who'd sit with me on the porch swing and tell me about his dreams for the future. Mom, he whispered, and the word was full of pain that had nothing to do with the bullet wound in his side. Cassie was still kneeling beside him, her hands covered in his blood as she tried uselessly to stop the bleeding. She was crying now, not the careful tears she'd probably used to manipulate him, but ugly, desperate sobs that shook her whole body. This wasn't supposed to happen, she kept saying. This wasn't supposed to happen. The hunter stood a few feet away, his rifle lowered, but still ready. He was watching all of us with the wariness of a man who'd stumbled into something much bigger and more complicated than he'd expected. We need to get him to a hospital, he said, his voice steady despite the circumstances. That wound needs proper medical attention. I felt the rope give way just as he spoke, the knots finally loosening enough for me to slip my hands free. My wrists were on fire, scraped raw and probably bleeding, but I didn't care. I scrambled across the forest floor to Tommy's side, pushing Cassie out of the way without thinking about it. She looked up at me with mascara streaking down her cheeks, and I saw something in her eyes I hadn't expected. Fear, yes, but also guilt. For the first time since this nightmare began, she looked like what she was, a young woman in way over her head, dealing with consequences she'd never imagined. Move, I said firmly, and she did, scooting backward to give me room. I pressed my hands against Tommy's wound, trying to remember the basic first aid I'd learned years ago when he was little, and I worried about everything that could hurt him. The blood was warm and sticky, and I could feel it pulsing against my palms. It's okay, baby, I murmured, the same words I'd used to comfort him through scraped knees and bad dreams. Mama's here. Everything's going to be okay. Tommy's breathing was shallow and fast, but his eyes stayed focused on my face. Mom, I'm sorry, he whispered. I'm so sorry for everything. Shh, I said, blinking back tears. Don't talk now. Just breathe. Just stay with me. The hunter had moved closer, kneeling on Tommy's other side. There's a ranger station about 2 miles back down the road, he said. They'll have a radio to call for help. But we need to get him there fast. I nodded, knowing he was right but terrified to move Tommy. What if we made the bleeding worse? What if we hurt him more than he already was? But looking at the pale pallor of his skin, I knew we didn't have a choice. Can you help me lift him? I asked the hunter. He was already moving, sliding his arms under Tommy's shoulders. On 3, he said. 1, 2, 3. Tommy cried out as we lifted him, the sound cutting through me like a knife. But we managed to get him upright, his arms draped over our shoulders, his feet dragging slightly as we started the long walk back through the forest. Cassie followed behind us, crying quietly. Every few steps she'd say something like, I didn't know, or this wasn't what I wanted, but I couldn't focus on her words. All my attention was on Tommy, on keeping him conscious, on getting him to safety. The walk back to the truck felt endless. Tommy's weight grew heavier with each step, and I could feel his strength fading. Several times his knees buckled and we had to stop to readjust our grip. The hunter, whose name I still didn't know, was strong and steady, never complaining about the burden. "What's your name?" I asked him during one of our rest stops, needing to focus on something other than my fear. "Bill," he said. "Bill Morrison. Been hunting these woods for 20 years. "Thank you," I said, and meant it more than he could possibly know. When we finally reached the truck, Bill helped me get Tommy into the passenger seat while Cassie climbed in the back. I got behind the wheel, grateful that the keys were still in the ignition. "You know where you're going?" Bill asked, and I realized he wasn't coming with us. "The ranger station?" He nodded. 2 miles back the way you came, then left at the fork. They'll have radio contact with emergency services." He paused, looking at Tommy's pale face through the windshield. "Drive fast, but be careful. These roads are tricky." As I started the engine, Tommy's head lolled against the seat. His eyes were closed, but his chest was still rising and falling. I pressed my foot to the accelerator, sending gravel flying as we pulled away from that cursed clearing. Behind us, I could see Bill in the rearview mirror, standing among the trees with his rifle at his side, watching us go. I said a silent prayer of thanks for his appearance, for his help, for the fact that there were still good people in the world willing to do the right thing when it mattered. In the passenger seat, Tommy stirred slightly. "Mom?" he whispered without opening his eyes. "I'm here, baby," I said, reaching over to squeeze his hand. "I'm right here, and I'm not going anywhere." For the first time in months, that felt like a promise I could keep. The fluorescent lights in the Cedar Falls General Hospital waiting room buzzed overhead, a constant electric hum that had been drilling into my skull for the past 6 hours. I sat in one of those uncomfortable plastic chairs, still wearing the clothes from this morning. Tommy's blood dried dark under my fingernails. The Rangers had called for an ambulance that met us halfway down the mountain road. I'd never been so grateful to see flashing lights and hear sirens in my entire life. The paramedics were young but professional, getting Tommy stabilized and loaded into the ambulance with an efficiency that spoke of too much practice with this kind of emergency. I rode with him, holding his hand while they worked, watching the monitors that beeped and flashed with information I didn't understand. Tommy was unconscious by then, his face so pale it was almost gray. But his pulse was steady, and the paramedic kept assuring me that was a good sign. Cassie had followed in her truck, arriving at the hospital about an hour after we did. She'd tried to talk to me once, when I was filling out paperwork in the emergency room, but I'd walked away without saying a word. There was nothing she could say that I wanted to hear. Not yet. Maybe not ever. The surgeon, Dr. Martinez, was a small woman with kind eyes and steady hands. She'd explained that the bullet had missed Tommy's vital organs, but had done damage to muscle and tissue that would require careful repair. "He's young and strong," she'd said. "That's in his favor." Now I was waiting for him to wake up from the anesthesia, counting the minutes on the wall clock and trying not to think about all the ways this day could have gone differently. Worse differently. Linda had driven down from Des Moines as soon as I called her, bringing coffee and sandwiches I couldn't eat, and the kind of quiet support only a sister could provide. She sat beside me, occasionally squeezing my hand, letting me know I wasn't alone. "Mrs. Patterson?" A nurse appeared at my elbow, young and tired-looking. "Your son is awake. You can see him now." My legs were unsteady as I stood up, probably from sitting too long, definitely from fear. Tommy's room was at the end of a long hallway that smelled like disinfectant and floor polish. I could hear the sound of my sneakers squeaking against the linoleum with each step. He was propped up in bed, still pale, but more alert than I'd seen him since the forest. There were tubes and wires connected to various parts of him, and a large bandage covered his left side. But his eyes were clear, and when he saw me, they immediately filled with tears. "Mom," he said, his voice rough and small. I pulled the visitor's chair close to his bed and sat down, not trusting myself to speak yet. For a moment, we just looked at each other. I was cataloging all the ways he looked like the little boy I remembered, searching for signs of the son I'd thought I'd lost. "I'm sorry," he whispered. and then the words came pouring out like water through a broken dam. Mom, I'm so sorry. For everything. For the things I said. For the way I treated you. For today. I don't know what happened to me. I don't know how I got so lost. The tears I'd been holding back all day finally came. But they were different from the ones I'd cried in recent months. These weren't tears of hurt, or confusion, or anger. These were tears of relief, of recognition, of finding something precious I'd thought was lost forever. I know, baby, I said, reaching for his hand. It was warm and solid and real. I know you're sorry. She made everything seem so different, he continued, the words tumbling over each other in his rush to explain. The things you did, the way you loved me, she made it all sound wrong somehow, like you were the problem instead of the solution. I squeezed his hand gently. She was wrong. I know that now. I knew it the moment I saw you bleeding in that forest, when I thought. He couldn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. But I wasn't entirely blameless either, I said, surprising myself with the admission. Maybe I did hold on too tight sometimes. Maybe I did make it harder for you to grow up. Tommy shook his head against his pillow. That's not. You were just being a mom. A good mom. I should have talked to you instead of listening to her poison everything. We sat in silence for a while, his hand in mine, both of us processing the long journey we'd taken to get to this moment. The monitors beeped steadily around us, and I could hear the sounds of the hospital continuing its work outside our little room. What happens now? Tommy asked eventually. Now you get better, I said, and we figure out how to be a family again. A different kind of family, maybe. One where you get to be an adult, and I get to learn how to let you. I don't want to lose you, Mom. Not again. You're not going to lose me, I promised. I'm not going anywhere, but maybe we both need to learn some new ways of being together. Tommy nodded, wincing slightly at the movement. What about Cassie? I'd been dreading this question, but I'd had hours to think about my answer. That's up to you, honey. But if you decide you want to see her, to work things out, you need to do it as yourself, not as the person she was trying to turn you into. I don't think I want to see her, he said quietly. Not for a long time anyway. Maybe never. I didn't tell him I thought that was probably for the best. That was a decision he needed to make for himself, in his own time. Dr. Martinez stopped by later to check on Tommy's progress and to explain his recovery timeline. A few more days in the hospital, then several weeks of taking it easy at home while the wound healed properly. Physical therapy would help him regain full strength in his core muscles. You're lucky, she told him. A few inches in either direction, and this could have been much more serious. After she left, Tommy looked at me with something like wonder. I really could have died today. But you didn't, I said firmly. You're here, and you're going to be fine. We're going to be fine, he corrected, and I knew he was right. As evening settled over the hospital, Tommy drifted off to sleep, exhausted by pain medication and the emotional weight of the day. I stayed in my chair, watching him breathe, marveling at how young and peaceful he looked, without all the anger and confusion that had been twisting his features for months. Linda poked her head in around 9 o'clock. How's he doing? Better, I said. We both are. She smiled and handed me a fresh cup of coffee. I brought you some things from home. Clean clothes, your toothbrush, that pillow you like. Thank you. I accepted the coffee gratefully. I think I'm going to stay the night. I figured you might. She kissed the top of my head. Call me if you need anything. After she left, the hospital settled into its nighttime quiet. Tommy slept deeply, and I dozed fitfully in my chair, waking every hour or so to make sure he was still breathing, still there, still mine. In the morning, he'd start the long work of healing, both physically and emotionally. We'd have to learn how to trust each other again, how to love each other in this new phase of our relationship. There would be difficult conversations, probably some setbacks, definitely some growing pains. But for now, in this small hospital room with its beeping machines and antiseptic smell, we had found our way back to each other, and that felt like the most important victory of all.